Story 1. I haven't seen this yet, so I'll add it. The hardest part for me was having to not be yourself. Naturally kind? Get all your things taken, in a killing them softly kind of way. The food you get used to right away. Anytime they decided they were short-staffed, you were stuck inside. One idiot argues with the med cart, your whole block gets tossed, and they take everything that's not legitimate. They included a TV you bought from someone, but since the receipt doesn't have your name on it, it's gone. Then there's the fact that you have to hide what you have no matter if you're tough or not, because it's kind of disrespectful when so many have nothing. And the ordering food from Commie Sense. If you're intelligent enough to learn Pinochle or read, then boredom shouldn't really be a thing. Story 2. You don't understand what freedom is until you lose it. The fact and feeling that you look at this door and know that you can't walk out now, tomorrow, or next week is something different once that's taken away from you. It's not like you sit at home and can walk out from your room to the kitchen or bathroom. There's only one room here, and you have no choice. Even when you're at work and you know you're stuck there for the next 8 hours, you still have that comfort that you know you could walk out at any time if you wanted. Where in prison, that comfort is taken away from you. Story 3. I'm in now after 6 years served of my 7-year total. The reason I can reply here now is because a month ago, I got transferred to a special section where you're locked up mostly in the evenings, but where you're free to go outside and work or go to therapy sessions during the daytime. So, yeah, I got my phone in my cell right now. I haven't had it with me for the past 6 years. Most of my time, I was in one of the few maximum security prisons in Belgium. What's been worse for me is the loss of liberty. Sure, even outside you're not 100% truly free, but when you get stripped of who you are, when you're powerless in almost every situation, that's a lot of tension that builds up over time. Especially when you get confronted with the injustice of our justice system. There's no logic to be made of any of it. You have to stay strong mentally to come out of that in a reasonably sane state. For years, you have to get along, rotate in a system with people that also have so much tension built up inside of them. People that you didn't get to choose to live together with. You get thrown in there and have to make it work. There's a hierarchy that has an impact on a lot of things inside. It's very time-consuming and energy-draining to be occupied with all that time. You've got to watch your back. I had access to a lot of things because I managed to move fluently through that jungle. But I've had some times where I found myself in a position where I could get challenged. It is strange saying it like that, but that's what it is. Story 4. I know a guy who committed financial fraud and got medium security prison for 6 years. He said the worst part was the non-stop noise from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Couldn't find a minute of quiet just to be alone with his thoughts for a few hours. Even reading was impossible. Story 5. The holidays and special days away from everything and everyone you care about. I spent 37 of the 156 months in the Illinois prison system in Pontiac, max security, in a single-man cell. 23 hours of my day were spent in complete darkness. No phone calls, no visits. I did get my audio-visual approval after 22 months, so I got my TV and radio after almost 2 years. But those 2 years were the longest, worst times of my life, man. One shower a week with the push button on and off that lasted 3 minutes. Whether your butt still had soap on it or was cleaned or not, that water was done. The stigma of prison, though, isn't as bad as the media would have you believe. Believe me, it's not all sunshine and rainbows and crap, not by any means. But it's not the 24/7 nightmare some would have you believe. Once you're institutionalized, that's just what life becomes as you know it. You either accept it and adapt to it, or you let the walls get to you and break you down. If I really wanted to get in depth about it and share the horror stories, I could write a book. Actually been a thought of mine more than a few times. Like the gang or race wars, or violence, or the treatment by staff of the inmates. And to be 100% honest, the worst experience of incarceration is exactly that. The treatment by the staff of those places. Somebody really needs to look into and investigate that, in depth, without being swayed or paid off by the system to cover the hell that they dish out. Story 6. So I do work at a prison as a teacher. The inmates complain about a lot of things. The food is terrible, the beds are hard, they're not allowed to own anything better than a PS2. But the worst part seems to be the waiting. You have to wait for everything and everyone. for the guards to get you, for getting doors open for you, waiting for other inmates while being counted, etc. I can certainly see how this messes you up. Story 7. I worked at a prison doing IT support. Only went to the cells on occasion, but to me, it's the paper-thin mattresses and the tiny room. Technically, by law, you are allowed 1 hour of free time outside the cell in the common area, but that's if everyone in the cell block doesn't act up. While this was a medium-level place, sentences were 1 year or less, so it was rare that they were on lockdown. Not much natural light for obvious reasons. Story 8. The worst part of incarceration is the moment you realize the world is just going by without you. I was locked up from 2019 to 2022, and the world changed a lot during that time. There was a pandemic, a presidential election, and several other things. When you're incarcerated, every day is the same. I didn't truly understand the impact these events had on our society until I was released. It has definitely taken some getting used to. Story 9. I've been a hostage, which is better than prison in some ways, but worse in others. The way it's worse, other than things like gunfights, starving, or hypothermia, is that you can get your head blown off at any moment for any reason. I had already seen that happen to another hostage who wasn't needed anymore, so that level of uncertainty hanging over you is pretty rough. Got to a point that I thought an hour had gone by when it had been 7 minutes. At least we had that sweet mountain air though. Story 10. Constant hunger and craving foods and treats available on the outside. Inmates constantly fight over petty things, wearing the same clothes over and over again, being treated like a file or just another case number, waking up each day to the same faces, scenarios, chats, etc. Everything is so expensive. Having to control your rage and emotions so as not to prolong your sentence by being aggressive towards someone. Boredom and playing reruns in your mind of the few happy moments you had on the outside. Daydreaming. Thinking about what you're going to do once outside, where to live, and how to get a life. Most people and businesses won't look you in the eyes. Whatever family you've got left will probably turn their back on you, unless you did something for them, like revenge their honor or stockpiled lots of money. Story 11. My husband did 13 years and 1 year in the hole. He said that was the worst mentality-challenging experience he had ever faced. Being locked in a room the size of my master closet 24/7, only to shower once a week. Only outside contact was a 15-minute phone call also once a week that needed to be requested beforehand. He said the thing that made him crazy the most was they turned the light off in his cell. Story 12. I've only been to county, but while I was locked, it was simply 1. The fact that for the first time in my adult life, I was in a concrete box I absolutely could not leave no matter what I did. And 2, the soul-crushing boredom of just sitting in the same room for months on end. People who have never been arrested act like being locked up is a vacation. Even in nicer places, this is disgustingly far from the truth. You have no idea how much it can mess with your psychology to be stuck in a box with no way out. Even if you scream or cry or beg, and even if you do, you'll just get the crap beat out of you and put in an even smaller box for longer. 0 out of 10. Do not recommend it. Story 13. Having worked as a correctional officer in a maximum security prison in Missouri before, the worst part about it for me was the lack of air conditioning in the summer when it's 96 degrees outside and the only AC is in the bubble. Then running showers in the Supermax housing units, walking up and down the walls, handcuffing offenders and escorting them to the showers in other wings, then handcuffing them and escorting them back to their cell in the other wing on the top walk. It was pretty fun messing with the other offenders in their cells and talking smack to them. Story 14. Not exactly terrible. In fact, it might actually have been the best thing I saw while in prison. This was in Oregon, by the way, reputable for being some of the least hard yards in the country. Still saw plenty of crazy things, but this is the only one I like to talk about. Coming back from chow, you walk down this super long football field length, 30-foot wide hall to get back to your cell block. Walking back, I've got my eye on 2 elderly lifers, both with canes, having a pretty animated discussion over who knows what at the end of the hall. As I continue walking towards them, apparently one of them says something the other doesn't like, because he picks up that cane and just beams the other dude on the head. I think, "Aw man, here we go, lockdown." and expect the other old-timer to go down, but nope. Homie must be made of sterner stuff because he picks up his cane and boom, full-on geriatric sword fight in the middle of the hallway. Kind of like the Inigo Montoya fight scene in The Princess Bride. Like, these dudes are really going at it. Clack, clack, clack. Occasionally getting each other. Couple of pretty gnarly lumps and gashes on each other's heads. And they're just going back and forth all over the hall. Both of them 80 years old plus, doing it Dark Ages style. It was wild. Eventually, the guards managed to sprint down the hall, huffing and puffing, and hose the two of them down with OC spray, and then drag them off to seg. But I will never forget my first old man stick fight. Story 15. Not the most messed up, but this did stick with me for whatever reason. While studying medicine, I was working at a prison clinic in New York. Guy comes in with a fairly dirty cast on his arm. Otherwise, he seems fairly normal. He's there to have his cast removed, so I ask him when they put the cast on. He's saying December. It's late January, so yeah, it's been enough time for the bone to heal. I figured his living conditions were the reason for the cast looking like that, so I got the okay and started removing the cast. The smell. His skin underneath looked terrible, and there were little pieces of wood and other crap embedded in the skin. Complete atrophy of the casted forearm. After further questioning, it turns out the cast had been on his arm for over a year, and it was just getting removed. I was glad to be getting out of that rotation. Story 16. I watched a guy come into a federal prison camp for a year and a day. They gave him a job driving a mower to mow grass. On his first day of mowing, he ran the mower off the edge of the pond. The mower flipped, the roll bar wasn't installed, they landed in about a foot of water, the back of the mower seat ended up on his neck, the mower on top of him, and he drowned. The one corrections officer at the camp wouldn't let us help, but couldn't lift it himself. So he called for help, but they had to come from the max across the street, and it was like 10 to 15 minutes. Finally, we as inmates said F it and ran to the water. It took 6 guys to lift the mower off his neck. The corrections officer and another inmate drug him out of the water. By then, the max prison COs and medical team had made it over. They started CPR. He was already dead. And they carried him on board, slid him in the back of the pickup truck bed, drove him to the front, life flight landed, and then took him away. Official report says he died on the way to the hospital in the helicopter, and his family believes that. I was one of the first to see him. I was the one that went screaming to get inmates to come help. That man was dead when he came out of the water. Story 17. Spent 5 years in New Jersey Department of Corrections. Honestly, the worst part of the whole bid was county jail, while I waited for the plea process to work out before being sent to state prison. I spent about 6 months in Camden County. I was unfortunately placed in maximum security because of the nature of my crime, first-degree armed robbery. At the time, I was a 140-pound white kid from the suburbs, and Camden was experiencing a massive shortage of space in the jail. Not a great combo for me. Slept on a mat on the ground near the toilet in a cell with 3 other guys. Cell had 1 bunk bed, so it was designed for 2 occupants. First meal on the tier, a guy was walking down the steps to get his food, and just as he approached the bottom, he got absolutely blindsided under the chin by another inmate wielding his tray as a weapon. The walloped guy goes to the ground, and the assailant proceeds to stab him in every possible place with what looked like a pin. I'd later learn that many of the tier's stabbing tools had pin handles. It turns out the victim was a Crip, but the whole jail was pretty much run by Bloods. Apparently, he was supposed to check in, opt for protective custody upon coming to the county, but I guess he didn't want to. So they essentially forced the issue. The altercation did not last long. Guards called a code, alarm went off, we all got locked in our cells, and the officers then rolled into the tier about 10 deep, and based on the sounds, couldn't see the action after lockdown, pummel the stabber. A month later, I was moved to a smaller tier, which was reserved for inmates facing larger sentences. I was indicted on 3 counts of first-degree armed robbery, as well as 9 different other peripheral crimes. It was much quieter, and the corrections officers treated us so much better. I was told this was because a lot of the guys in this tier had nothing to lose, and when things got bad on this tier, they never did in the 6-ish months I was there, it generally went straight to nightmare mode. I did see some other objectionably worse stuff while in state prison, But I guess I was desensitized at that point, because when I think back, the first thing I see is the guy getting decked with a hard plastic food tray. Story 18. I did a year spread out over a few 2 yards in Arizona, low-level yards. I didn't see much that really shocked me. I'd been on the street prior to being locked up, so anything I saw happen in prison was more of the same, really. There were fights, and people catching heat from other people for messing up and breaking rules. But for the most part, it was fairly tame. I think the part that sticks with me the most is the amount of very clearly mentally ill people who were locked up with me, but were getting no help whatsoever. I mean, none of us were really getting any help, but some of these guys were clearly going to have no option when they left, except to go back to what they were doing. To me, that was the worst thing I saw. The absolute apathy of the system as a whole. I was incarcerated with 1,200 other inmates on 1 yard in Tucson, in a complex that I believe had 7 or 8 other yards on it. This is, of course, one of many complexes in Arizona. This also came as a shock to me when I really thought about it. Just the incredible amount of people being locked up. Most of the people I did time with were in for non-violent drug-related offenses. Story 19. I've never been to prison, but my uncle has, and his story was really interesting and kind of disturbing. We live in Mexico, Guadalajara. My uncle has diabetes, and at that time his health was really bad. He had a divorce 12 years ago, and he lost contact with his ex-wife, so she didn't know about his condition. She didn't receive her pension, so she sued him. And by the end of that week, he was taken to a prison called Puente Grande. He was there for only 3 days. It was easy to prove that it was impossible to work in that state, but he saw a lot of terrifying stuff there. First of all, prisoners have a hierarchy there. When new prisoners come in, there are prisoners with power to judge them and punish them according to their stories on how they got there. The guards know this, but there's a lot of people with power inside the cells. According to my uncle, they were taken to a large room by the guards. When they left, other prisoners came and started questioning them. One of the new prisoners admitted to taking advantage of a girl, getting caught by the police, and ended up in prison. The other prisoners got so disgusted they beat him up with a stick. He saw this happen before he was questioned himself. Thankfully, nothing bad happened to my uncle when he was there, and he got out of there as soon as we were able to prove that he had diabetes. He told this story just as he got out of there, and when I was 17. Story 20. It's not the craziest thing I saw, but it's a social norm in prison that goes on daily. I'll never forget how socially acceptable jackers were. Like somebody would be wearing a coat or hoodie, etc., and stare at a female corrections officer, and then back off. Sometimes sitting on a bench, sometimes the TV room, and nobody bats an eye. One time, a dude was like, "Hey man, can you move a row over? She knows I'm watching," and didn't skip a beat cranking off to an ugly 60-something-year-old woman. It's messed up, but after a while you just accept that some people went nuts in there. In the Florida prison system, they used to call it gunning. I assume they still do, though I've been out for a long time. Joe over there in the shower is gunning Miss Lewis down.